When the Titanic slipped beneath the North Atlantic in the early hours of April 15, 1912, nearly 1,500 souls were lost. Although their lives were over, their stories were not. In the days that followed, a grim and solemn task began. From Halifax, Nova Scotia, the cable ship Mackay-Bennett was among the first vessels sent to search the icy waters, tasked with recovering as many of the victims as possible. What the crew encountered was haunting, an endless expanse of debris and the solemn presence of those who had once walked the great liner's decks. For the sailors, the work was difficult. For the Undertakers and the clergy waiting on shore, it was heartbreaking. Halifax, Nova Scotia was the base of action for these dreaded expeditions. We're looking in detail like never before at this chapter of Titanic's story.
The picture frame is made from a piece of wreckwood of Titanic.
Looking at rare artifacts, lost transcripts of communication, and forgotten evidence to understand why Halifax was once called the City of the Dead. There, 150 victims remain to this day, buried beneath simple headstones, their names and stories still echoing across time.
I was struck in every case by the dignity of these people.
This is the often overlooked month that followed the Titanic disaster, the story of those who carried out an unimaginable duty, and the city that became the final guardian of so many lost souls.
It was here that the victims of the Titanic were landed by the Mackay-Bennett.
This is Titanic's aftermath. This is the Nova Scotian story on Part-Time Explorer. Before we journey back to one of Nova Scotia's darkest stories from its past, it's fitting to recognize those who have helped shape its present and its future. Which brings us to this video's sponsor. The Stevens Group of Companies stands as a testament to enduring legacy and community commitment. Founded in the 1930s by Burnett David Stevens, this third-generation family-owned construction company has been, quote, better built since 1935. From pioneering tilt-up construction techniques across the Maritimes to developing residential communities like Bridgeview in Halifax, the Stevens Group has played a pivotal role in shaping Nova Scotia's landscape. But their impact goes beyond bricks and mortar. The Stevens family's dedication to Nova Scotia is evident in their support of local initiatives through contributions made by the Stevens Family Foundation, which aims to enhance support within the maritime communities. Their story is woven into the very fabric of the province, embodying a deep respect for its history and a commitment to its future. We're proud to have the Stevens Group of Companies support this video, and we thank them for their unwavering dedication to Nova Scotia. To learn more about their work and their legacy, visit stevensgroup.ca. Before we get too far into this story, please be warned, it's a difficult one. It was hard to write, and my animator, my consultants, and myself found it hard to get through some parts of it. I try not to be too graphic and I won't show any disturbing images, but it is tragically haunting and it will stick with you. April 15th, 1912. The last of Titanic's lifeboats are leaving the sinking ship. The band plays ragtime and waltzes as the ship's officers try desperately to evacuate the roughly 1,600 people that are still trapped aboard the liner into the remaining lifeboats. It's women and children first, but for those who can't find their way up to the boat deck, it's almost entirely hopeless. Some families are separated. Husbands and fathers told to stay behind as tearful goodbyes are exchanged for the last time. Other families choose to stay behind together. The stern of the ship strains and groans as it's lifted into the air, and the bow sinks rapidly, with a wave sweeping across the decks. The last two boats float off, swarmed by desperate people clinging to anything that floats. 1,500 people rush uphill towards the back of the ship as Titanic begins to dive. The funnels fall. The sea churns into the ship, tearing apart its interiors and rips debris back out. As the back of the ship climbs into the sky, crowded with terrified and wretched passengers, the ship buckles, collapsing around the third funnel and shattering into thousands of pieces as if an explosion had taken place. The sea rushes in faster now, the stern rapidly settling into the water, climbing up once more as it is dragged beneath the waves. Darkness descends as hundreds of people struggle amongst the maelstrom left behind. Titanic breaking apart more as it free falls beneath them to the sea floor. Flotsam shoots to the surface, violently bursting up in the middle of the crowd. It is 28 degrees Fahrenheit, -2 Celsius. The screams do not last long. "8 a.m., April 15th, 1912. The Cunard liner RMS Carpathia, which had been en route to the Mediterranean and deviated to come to the assistance of the Titanic, had just finished picking up the last of Titanic's 712 survivors from her 20 drifting lifeboats. She turned around to return to North America. Where they were going exactly, that was yet to be decided. The chairman of the White Star Line, which owned the Titanic, was J. Bruce Ismay. He had survived the sinking and was now on board the Carpathia. And so Carpathia's captain, Captain Arthur Rostron, consulted with Mr. Ismay about where the Carpathia was to drop off Titanic's survivors. The nearest major port was Halifax, Nova Scotia in Canada, a port familiar to Rostron and the Carpathia. Consideration was given to it, and the word had leaked to the press that Carpathia might be going to Halifax, which led to some of the families of those on board the Titanic frantically purchasing railway tickets to get up to Halifax to greet their loved ones when they arrive. But Halifax did not remain a consideration for long. Logistically, it made more sense to go to New York City. It's where Titanic's passengers were already traveling to, and it would have been less of an inconvenience for those who were already suffering. Practically speaking, it was safer. If the Carpathia traveled north towards Halifax, it would have to navigate through the dreaded ice field that had just sunk the Titanic. New York allowed them to safely avoid it. Carpathia changed course and headed for New York City. In its wake was a sea of devastation, floating furniture, wreckage, and the bodies of 1,496 victims of the sinking. It was a dark, bleak day at the White Star Line offices in New York. Grim, but not quiet. A mob had gathered outside, frantically trying to get word of their relatives who were aboard the Titanic. And inside, employees were working around the clock to get the facts, and to answer the next glaring question. What was to be done about the bodies 700 miles offshore? Recovery operations would be needed, and it made more sense to arrange these efforts from a port closer to the wreck site than New York City. The actual closest land to the disaster was the Dominion of Newfoundland. It was briefly considered, and the base of operations would have been St. John's, but it posed one very obvious problem. Newfoundland was an island, remote from the rest of North America with no overland connections. Ultimately, Halifax, Nova Scotia was chosen as the base of the recovery operations. It was the second closest large port, but importantly, it offered railway access to the rest of the continent. Not only could bodies be shipped out easily, but additional personnel and supplies could be brought in as needed. In Halifax, news of the disaster had broken, but like the rest of the world, they hadn't yet realized the full extent of the devastation. Rumors persisted that the ship may still be afloat or that all on board may have been saved, but the city of Halifax had a special concern. 2 of its residents were on board, and their fate was still unknown. Traveling in first class was prominent Haligonian and philanthropist George Wright. George had established a prominent worldwide business directory, listing off thousands and thousands of companies of various trades around the world, the guide for the new class of international businessman. George financed the construction of several buildings across the city, 3 buildings on Barrington Street, including the Marble Building and the Wright Building, and housing across the city's south end. Directly across the street from his home parish of St. Paul's Anglican Church is this house, the former home of a woman named Hilda Slayter. Hilda was also traveling aboard the Titanic. She was in second class. After having recently been living in Europe, she was traveling aboard the Titanic back to Canada to be married. Although she was born here, she was not currently a resident of Halifax at the time of the disaster.
We're standing across from where Hilda Slayter lived. Her dad was a doctor, and his practice was in the main level, and the family lived upstairs.
The city waited in suspense with the rest of the world, but there were a few individuals in Halifax who had some idea how terrible this disaster actually was. Halifax was very much a Cunard town, and the White Star Line and Cunard Line were long-standing rivals. Halifax is where the Cunard Line began, and White Star Line ships rarely, if ever, went into Halifax. The White Star Line had no offices in Halifax, but they did have a local booking agent who acted as their representative for the rare Nova Scotian who did want to travel White Star. This was A.G. Jones and Company at 159 Hollis Street, who acted on behalf of several shipping lines who did not have offices in Halifax. By midday, April the 15th, less than 12 hours after the Titanic had disappeared, A.G. Jones and Company had been contacted and contracted to manage the recovery operations in Halifax on White Star Line's behalf. They had a daunting challenge ahead of them. This had never really happened before. When a ship sank in the middle of the Atlantic, the victims were gone. Unless a ship sank close to shore, close enough for salvage efforts to be done, like on the Atlantic, nobody was ever recovered. It was like removing bodies from the top of Mount Everest. It was risky, it was arduous, and a procedure to do something like this had never been established. The largest funeral home and undertaker in Nova Scotia at the time was Halifax's own John Snow and Company Limited, and A.G. Jones contracted them to lead the work with embalming the burials. But with such a massive number of casualties, John Snow called on his fellow members of the Funeral Directors Association of the Maritimes, which included undertakers from across New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Nova Scotia, to come to Halifax with their tools and to assist. So the undertaker team was assembled, but now they needed a ship. That was the next task for A.G. Jones and Company. There were many ships in Halifax at the time, with it being one of the busiest ports in eastern Canada, ships ranging from coastal liners to pleasure boats, to fishing vessels, from warships of the Royal Navy to the second oldest saltwater ferry system in the world. But there was also a strong presence of cable ships, built for laying and maintaining undersea cables around the world. At a pier on the Halifax waterfront sat one of these cable vessels, the Mackay-Bennett. The commercial cable company, which owned the Mackay-Bennett and other similar ships, anticipated that their services might be needed and recalled all of their vessels back to Halifax. The Mackay-Bennett was the first to arrive back in port. The Mackay-Bennett was built in Scotland in 1884 with the express purpose of servicing transatlantic undersea cables. She was 270 feet long and had a tonnage of 1,731. The Mackay-Bennett's construction made her perfect for the grisly task assigned to her. Cable ships required large, open holds for the cables to be spiraled around flat inside, and these holds would now be used as morgues and as ice storage. The ship had the unique feature of having a rudder on both the bow and the stern, allowing for greater maneuverability, a useful feature when navigating to retrieve people from the water. In 1912, she had been stationed in Halifax for an extended period of time, servicing the cables between Canada and France. A.G. Jones had contracted with the commercial cable company to charter the Mackay-Bennett for a little over $500 a day to go out and pick up Titanic's dead. The crew was not forced to take this assignment. Because of the terrible task ahead of them, each individual crewman was allowed to accept or decline this job. But if they accepted, they would be receiving double wages. John Snow would be accompanying the Mackay-Bennett on this grisly voyage as lead undertaker, preserving the bodies and personal belongings recovered at sea for final processing once they arrive back in Halifax. To oversee the spiritual services, Canon Kenneth Hines, Anglican, from Halifax's Cathedral of All Saints, would be joining the Mackay-Bennett on this trip as well. On the dock at the Halifax wharfs, the 28-year-old cable ship was loaded up with supplies needed for this trip. Wooden coffins, sheets of canvas, embalming and mortuary supplies, and many, many tons of ice to help preserve the bodies. The crew was in high spirits for this mission, good money, what seemed like an easy task at the time, and their morale was boosted even further by a special reward that had just been offered. John Jacob Astor IV was the richest man on the Titanic, one of the richest men in the world, and was lost in the sinking. His family offered a prize of $100,000 US for the retrieval of his body. $100,000 in 1912 was around $3.25 million today. The morning of April 17th was a foggy one as the final preparations were made for Mackay-Bennett's departure. Rumors persisted that the Carpathia, still steaming to New York, was not the only ship to be carrying survivors from the Titanic. In fact, some people still clung to the false hopes that all had survived, but on a different rescue ship. One ship believed to have been in the area was the cable ship Minia, also based in Halifax at the time. Early on April 17th, Minia steamed into port, and the final hopes that this ship had Titanic survivors were dashed. The press swarmed the Minia when it returned to Halifax, with someone asking the Captain de Carteret, if he believed the Mackay-Bennett would have much luck in recovering bodies. De Carteret responded that this would be an impossible task, reasoning that the ship was too deep and the pressure down there was too great for any bodies to float up to the surface. Ironically, he himself would be tasked with that very job less than a week later. But his was an opinion shared by most. Some believed that the bodies would have drifted too far to be found a week later. Others thought that most would have been caught in the ship's suction as it went down, or simply trapped in the rigging and pulled down with the ship. To many, Mackay-Bennett's mission was a futile one, but one that needed to be attempted. But that pessimism is why the ship was loaded up with only 100 coffins. Shortly after noon that same day, 4 piers away from the cable ship Minia, the CS Mackay-Bennett slipped from its moorings and backed out into the Halifax harbor. Although partial lists of Titanic's survivors were transmitted by the Carpathia, a complete roster of them was not available until the ship arrived in New York City in the evening of April 18th. That was when Halifax found out that its own Hilda Slayter had survived the disaster. George Wright did not. He kept to himself during the voyage, and nobody truly knows what happened to him. It's been speculated that because his friends knew him to be a heavy sleeper, he may have slept through most of the sinking until it was too late to escape. But who knows? The next question is, will his body be recovered? The fog bank that rolled into Halifax reached far out to sea. Mackay-Bennett sailed through it for days with choppy, cold water spraying her deck. It was miserable. Rarely could they fix their position, often relying on dead reckoning. The final position of Titanic was known, but the currents and winds made the location of the debris field a variable. Mackay-Bennett's telegraph operator put out a request for any ships in the area that encountered Titanic's debris field to please report the coordinates to them. The first ship to do so was the steamer Rhine of the Norddeutscher Lloyd Line, who sent the position to the Mackay-Bennett. The Mackay-Bennett adjusting course to head in that direction. On April 20th, 5 days after the sinking, the weather began to clear as the Mackay-Bennett approached the position reported by the Rhine. There was another ship steaming through the area as the Mackay-Bennett approached the scene. This was the SS Bremen, built in 1896 and also operated by the Norddeutscher Lloyd Line. As the Bremen arrived at the wreck site, passengers rushed up on deck to get a glimpse of the morbid scene. White specks littered the sea, stretching all the way to the horizon. These were bodies, floating and with their lifebelts catching the afternoon sun. Some were clumped in groups, as though they had been clinging to each other for survival. Others were alone. Debris from the ship was scattered everywhere. As the ship steamed through, they spotted several icebergs, including one that matched the description of the berg Titanic struck. A quick-thinking passenger pulled out his camera, snapping photographs of it. The captain of the Bremen did not stop to retrieve any of the bodies or debris. They were aware of the Mackay-Bennett's mission, as they were in communication with it through the wireless. They transmitted their position, which greatly aided the Bennett. As the sun disappeared over the horizon to the west, with the SS Bremen following it, the Mackay-Bennett steamed onto the scene, arriving at 8 p.m. It was too late in the evening for the Mackay-Bennett's crew to get to work, so they closed in on the debris field, stopped their engines, dropped a sea anchor, and stood by alongside the bodies as they awaited the morning when their grisly work would begin. April 21st, 1912. Day 1 of the body recovery. The ocean still swelled beneath them, a far cry from the sea of glass in which Titanic had sunk. The waves rocked Mackay-Bennett from side to side, but conditions were good enough that the recovery could commence. At 6 a.m. with the sunrise, Mackay-Bennett's boats were put into the water, and a crew of 5 or 6 men manned each boat. As the boats went out, the Mackay-Bennett's telegraph operator sent notice to the White Star Line offices in New York that they were on the scene and the work had commenced.
There was a great deal of difficulty in coordinating between New York and Halifax and the ships that were out in the ocean. You have to remember that wireless in those days was very sporadic. A thunderstorm could disrupt things. A thunderstorm could actually cause a mistake in transcribing what a message was. There are a number of telegrams, even from the White Star's Liverpool office, asking to please clarify the identification of this person. Are you sure it's so-and-so, and that sort of thing.
Charles Haas is the president of the Titanic International Society, and in his collection is a unique set of artifacts. Original telegrams detailing the communication between the White Star Line and the recovery efforts.
There are 181 telegrams, communications between the Mackay-Bennett. There are a couple from the Minia and the White Star office in New York. There were also communications between White Star and its Halifax agent.
These records give us a unique insight into the voyage of the Mackay-Bennett. Undertaker John Snow devised a plan where each body recovered would be assigned a number given in the order in which they were found, and have a corresponding sack in which all of their personal belongings that were found with them would be stored for safekeeping. The numbers would give them a temporary identity while their names were figured out. The first body found was that of a boy, believed to be Walter Van Billiard, 9 years old, of American parents but born in France, drifting alone in the middle of the ocean. It was clear now that this job was going to be traumatizing, leaving permanent emotional scars on Mackay-Bennett's crew. Body number 4, found early in the recovery process in the morning of the first day, was one of many that would haunt the crew, but this one took them by surprise. Believed to be just 2 years old, a young, fair-haired boy wearing a gray coat, brown strapped shoes, and what's today called a onesie. The tenderness with which his mother dressed him for the cold as the Titanic sank a week prior was still evident, and he was the only body ever to be recovered that was not wearing a life jacket. Titanic simply did not have life jackets small enough to fit him. All of the bodies were handled respectfully, but this one was given special care. The rough sailors in the crew of the Mackay-Bennett were heartbroken by him, with some of them almost feeling as though he was their own son, especially Clifford Crease and Stephen Campbell, the 2 men who hauled the boy out of the water. The bodies were found scattered. Often only their heads would be visible floating above the waves, and the white life jackets would help them stand out against the dark seas. The crew of the Bennett expected the bodies would be in bad shape, but surprisingly, most of them looked as though they were simply asleep, aside from their eyes being wide open. Meanwhile, at the center of Halifax is St. Paul's Anglican Church, the oldest church in Halifax, in fact, the oldest building in Halifax. This was the home parish of Halifax's own Titanic survivor, Hilda Slayter, who was now recovering from the disaster in New York City. Around midday, a hymn service was held here for the faithful departed of the Titanic disaster. A copy of the printed hymnal from this service is preserved in a display case at the church today. By dusk, the boats of the Mackay-Bennett had returned to the ship, offloading their final batch of bodies for the day as the boats were hauled back on board. 51 bodies had been found on the first day alone. As they were brought on board, John Snow got to work immediately in sorting them. Who may be identified, who could be preserved, and what class they might be in. Based on those 3 criteria, it was determined that 26 of those bodies would be brought back to Halifax, and 25 would not. That evening, Canon Hine presided over the burial at sea of those 25 bodies. With a prayer, they were strapped with weights, draped in the British flag, and dropped into the sea. Most of these 25 were believed to be crew of the Titanic and thus were the lowest priority to bring back to land, but a burial at sea was believed to be an appropriate and respectable way to handle men of the sea. After the burial, Snow and his team worked through the night to preserve the other bodies. Day 2 began with sunrise. The boats put back into the water and the crew returned to work. Day 2 was marked by the recovery of the body of John Jacob Astor. Surely there was some celebration among the crew as they would be receiving that reward money, but I'm sure it was overshadowed by the terrible task at hand. An overturned lifeboat was found. This was Titanic's collapsible lifeboat B, which floated off the ship upside down, but an air pocket inside of it allowed it to maintain buoyancy, and around 28 men managed to cling to it for survival under the command of Titanic's second officer, Officer Charles Lightoller. Initially, the Mackay-Bennett attempted to recover the boat, but they couldn't get a good grip on it, and they abandoned their plan. They did, however, lift it enough to confirm that no bodies were trapped beneath it. Throughout the day, the Mackay-Bennett's telegraph operator was in communication with the offices of the White Star Line in New York.
There was also an argument, not an argument, but a discussion between the Mackay-Bennett and New York. They reported to New York that they were retaining people that they had identified as first or second class, but they were burying at sea the ones that they thought were third class. The New York office got wind of that, and the company let the Mackay-Bennett know it's absolutely essential that all bodies be brought to shore to the extent that health and safety and the condition of the body would permit. And at that point, you actually start to see names of third-class passengers showing up in the identification listings that are being generated. So it's kind of ironic that even in death, passengers were separated by class in terms of the way they were treated.
But they fixed that.
They did.
Yes, that's good.
Yeah.
Before departure, the crew of the Mackay-Bennett had been informed that only preserved bodies would be permitted to enter the port of Halifax for health and safety reasons. So burials at sea would continue, but those would be the victims that couldn't be preserved, regardless of class. News of the discovery of John Jacob Astor's body was telegraphed to New York, and the family was informed. Hoping to avoid the media spotlight, a representative was sent to claim his body rather than the family doing it themselves. But Astor's 19-year-old son, Vincent, chose to go as well. He took a break from his studies at Harvard and, having first gone to New York to meet Carpathia, now traveled to Halifax by himself, his face buried in his hands, weeping for much of the journey. He was one of many relatives of Titanic's victims who made this journey, hoping to greet their loved ones one last time and escort them for final burial. He arrived in Halifax and checked into a hotel and simply waited for the Mackay-Bennett to return. But it wasn't only relatives who came to Halifax. The press from across Canada and beyond swarmed the city looking for a story, intruding on the morticians, the dock workers, the shipping offices, and even the victims' families. Vincent had no peace while he was in Halifax. Anytime he stepped out of his hotel, he was swarmed by journalists. The press also eavesdropped on telegraph communications between the recovery efforts and the White Star Line, to the point where the White Star Line actually took measures to maintain its privacy.
The telegraphic messages, some of them are actually in a code that White Star was using to keep things private. Beneath these total gibberish words are the English translations. And I know Jack spent years trying to find the code that generated all of it, and we were never able to pin it down. So it may have been a private White Star code. I don't know.
As the mission progressed, it became clear that far more bodies were still present out there than initially anticipated, and with the new orders from the White Star Line that every body possible must be brought back to Halifax, it became clear that the Mackay-Bennett could not do this mission alone. That same day, April 22nd, the second day of work for the Mackay-Bennett, A.G. Jones and Company chartered another ship, this time from the Anglo-American Telegraph Company, better known as Western Union. The cable ship Minia, the same ship that some had hoped may be carrying additional survivors of the Titanic, was now being sent to retrieve more victims.
So Minia had to load up in Halifax. They loaded up 150 coffins. They loaded up ice and iron. All of that had to be just kind of thrown in where the cable was already stored because there was no time to remove the cable.
The lead undertaker assigned to Minia was William Snow, brother of John Snow, currently aboard the Mackay-Bennett. Reverend Cunningham of St. George's Anglican Church, also known as George's Round Church in Halifax, joined the Minia to preside over any burials and to provide spiritual comfort for her crew. The Minia was an older and larger vessel than the Mackay-Bennett. At 328 feet long, it was almost 60 feet longer than the Bennett. Built in 1866 in Scotland and converted for cable work, the Minia was capable of handling far more bodies than the Mackay-Bennett. Minia was chartered, equipped, and put out to sea all within a matter of hours, departing Halifax on April 22nd. As the day came to a close for the Mackay-Bennett, the recovery ship reached the heart of the debris field. There, amid the shifting waters, lay a somber congregation, a cluster of over 100 bodies drawn together by unseen currents, drifting in quiet unison. Could it be said that this is where the Titanic went down? Well, it's too abstract to put it that way, but in a way, yes. The spot was miles from the actual position of the wreck, a testament to the ocean's ceaseless, abstract motion. The tide had twisted and carried what remained, the wreck's aftermath scattered and untethered from the coordinates of the ship's final plunge. And yet, in this drifting cluster, there was a quiet echo of that terrible night. Nothing about this location was physically tied to the spot in which Titanic sank, and yet, this was the grouping of bodies that the ship had directly sank out from under. This was too large a task to take on in the final hours of the day. The sea anchor was dropped, and the Mackay-Bennett stood by, saving this task for the morning. Through the night, Snow and his team worked on the bodies while the Minia made its way to assist. Day 3 was the biggest day for the Mackay-Bennett as the boats were launched to begin working on the massive field of victims. The men in the boats had been informed that a cluster of around 100 bodies awaited them, and they didn't believe it, at least not until they saw it. As the boats worked into the evening, a passing steamer, the Sardinian of the Allen Line, came up alongside the Mackay-Bennett, aware of its noble mission to see if they could offer the Mackay-Bennett any support. The Bennett accepted a supply of canvas to be made into body bags, and the Bennett gave the Sardinian a stack of dispatches from her crew. April 23rd saw the recovery of 88 bodies, and there were still many more out there. The day had had a profound impact on Mackay-Bennett's crew. A solemnity, a sincerity, almost a camaraderie with the bodies still adrift. As the crew retired for the night, someone took a searchlight and flashed out into the darkness "Good night" in Morse code. Fog persisted the next morning. Mackay-Bennett periodically blasted its whistle as a signal to any ships in the area to stand clear of them. The journals of the crew that day became more abstract. How many ways can you describe a body being found before it all blends together? Mackay-Bennett's engineer, Frederick Hamilton, had kept a detailed journal of the daily activities, and his entry for April 24th was nothing more than a feeling surrounding the mass burials. Quote, "The hoarse tone of the steam whistle reverberated through the mist, the dripping rigging, and the ghostly sea, the heaps of dead, and the hard, weather-beaten faces of the crew, whose harsh voices joined sympathetically in the hymn tunefully rendered by Canon Hind, all combined to make a strange task stranger. Cold, wet, miserable, and comfortless. All hands balance themselves against the heavy rolling of the ship as she lurches to the Atlantic swell, and even the most hardened must reflect on the hopes and fears, the dismay and despair of those whose nearest and dearest support and pride have been wrenched from them by this tragedy. This famous photograph was taken at the same burial service that Mr. Hamilton had just described. On April 26th, the Minia joined the Mackay-Bennett at the site of the disaster.
When they reached the sinking site, the weather was very bad. So a lot of fog and wind and cold weather. When they passed over the site where Titanic sank, Reverend Cunningham, who was on board, conducted a service in the saloon to sort of give tribute to the souls who had perished. And my grandfather thought this was a lovely thing to do.
The Minia set right to work in recovering the bodies in very much the same procedure that the Mackay-Bennett was following. The first body that they picked up was that of Charles Hayes, president of the Grand Trunk Railway. He was found with several pieces of paper identifying him, as well as a pair of brown leather gloves. Those gloves are now on display at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. Minia's telegraph operator, Francis Dyke, immediately sent word that Charles Hayes had been found, a message that was forwarded directly to the Grand Trunk Railway offices, who dispatched a private rail car to pick up the body in Halifax as soon as the Minia would return. The sea was littered with debris which shocked the crew of the Minia as they arrived.
Let me read you a little bit from my grandfather's letter. The Titanic must have blown up when she sank, as we have picked up pieces of the grand staircase, and most of the wreckage is from below deck. It must have been an awful explosion, too, as some of the main deck planking, 4 feet thick, was all split and broken off short.
The grand staircase pieces that the Minia retrieved are on display in the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. They picked up many artifacts from the water as souvenirs, as did the Mackay-Bennett. Some were carved up by the Minia's carpenter into something else, such as pieces of the ship's paneling being turned into picture frames. Or cribbage boards, some ornate, others quite plain. Some items found continued use with their original purpose, like this cutting board from one of Titanic's galleys. Rather than cleaning it up, the cut marks were preserved by the new owner, as each knife mark in the board tells a small story of Titanic. Some pieces were recovered that were simply too beautiful to cut up and recycle, like this panel which hung over the entryway to Titanic's first-class lounge. This piece gave inspiration to director James Cameron's film crew and was the basis for the piece of wood, often incorrectly referred to as a door, that Rose climbed onto in the 1997 film Titanic. As you can see, it's much smaller in real life. Many, many deck chairs were retrieved of various designs. Saloon chairs and full cabinets. Now some may call this grave robbing. But these were sailors, and to them, finding these items and repurposing them was a way that a little piece of the Titanic might live once more. By this point, Mackay-Bennett's crew and supplies were exhausted, and the ship couldn't accommodate any more bodies. A boat from the Bennett was sent to the Minia to retrieve additional supplies, and once it returned, the Mackay-Bennett offered a salute and set a heading for Halifax. The torch had been passed to the Minia as the Mackay-Bennett sailed back to shore. The Bennett had found 306 bodies in total, of which 116 had been buried at sea. 190 remained with the ship, stored in ice chests, coffins, and out on the open deck under canvas tarps. April 30th, 13 days after its departure, the Mackay-Bennett came into Halifax Harbor in the early morning, picking up its pilot at Devil's Island. The anticipation was high in Halifax as they awaited the arrival of what had been called the Death Ship. It was said that the city was dressed in funeral garb as the Mackay-Bennett entered the harbor. Businesses had their windows blacked out, flags flew at half-mast, and church bells rang out across the city in unison as the Mackay-Bennett made its way along the Halifax waterfront, its own flag flying at half-mast as well. This model, located in the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic, gives us a good idea of how the Mackay-Bennett looked as it steamed into port. Coffins were piled on the stern, which contained women, children, and the bodies most likely to be claimed by relatives. On the bow, beneath canvas cloths, were additional bodies. Now, these bodies were not intentionally denied coffins. The crew of the Mackay-Bennett were simply under-equipped for the number of bodies they were finding. The Bennett didn't go to its usual pier, located a little south of the foot of the McDonald Bridge today. It steamed past, moving up to the Halifax Naval Yard instead, where a special pier had been readied for her. The high stone walls and military personnel offered additional privacy and security for Mackay-Bennett's crew as they offloaded their cargo.
So here was jetty number 4, and it was the coaling wharf. And it was here that the victims of the Titanic were landed by the Mackay-Bennett. This was dock number 4. They didn't call them docks in those days, they called them wharves or jetties, of course, in the Navy. So this was jetty 4. And sometimes when you read about the Titanic and the bodies coming ashore, it often gets said that the bodies were brought to coaling dock number 4. Well, that's actually misleading. There was only one coaling dock, and it was called the coaling dock or jetty 4. So jetty 4 was the coaling dock.
Additional coffins and a fleet of hearses were waiting for the Bennett as it pulled broadside along the wharf. Each and every one of these coffins and hearses were searched thoroughly before they were permitted to enter the yard to ensure that there weren't any stowaways inside trying to get in to see the ship arrive. One by one, the bodies were offloaded from the Bennett and brought down onto the docks, but not without incident. An undertaker from Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, who was helping haul the bodies off the ship, ended up breaking his arm somehow. Stephen Campbell and Clifford Crease, who found body number 4, the 2-year-old unidentified child, took special care when hauling his casket off, certainly one of the most emotional moments of the offloading process. The undertakers went right to work, loading the coffins into the hearses. This replica hearse, made locally in Nova Scotia, gives us an idea of what these carts were like that hauled Titanic's victims up from the docks.
So this is owned by a local company that has reproduced a carriage that looks like the funeral carriages of the past. And in 1912, this is the type of carriage that was used for the bringing of the bodies to the mortuary of the dead of the Titanic. And this is the traditional carriage that brought their bodies to the cemetery.
These hearses moved up the steep hill of North Street to Agricola Street, turning right and continuing for 2 blocks to the Mayflower curling rink. It's on this spot where the Halifax Army-Navy store stands today, where the Mayflower curling rink once stood. It was a fun place. It was a sports center with an icy floor like an ice rink. People would skate around, play curling, socialize, and have a good time. The ice rink floor made it the perfect temporary storage house for the 190 bodies brought back by the Mackay-Bennett, as well as any additional ones that may be brought by the Minia. That same day that the bodies were brought up to the rink, the families of the victims were also brought in to begin the process of identifying their relatives so that they may be claimed and brought home with them by rail. Now, seeing so many bodies simply lying out in the wide open room of the curling rink would be too much for anyone coming in search of relatives, so canvas cubicles were installed to divide up the room, and each cubicle contained 3 coffins, so the enormity of the tragedy was less shocking to those already grieving. Once a family claimed a body, it was made ready by the morticians to travel. Over 40 of these morticians came to Halifax to assist, but only one of these was female. Mary Walsh, founder of O'Neill Funeral Home in St. John, New Brunswick, was put in charge of processing all of the women and children's bodies who had been found. Frank Newell was an undertaker from Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, brought into Halifax to assist Snow's funeral home. The first body that he was given to work on was body number 22, and he was assigned to prepare it to be shipped back to the family in Boston. As Frank uncovered it and saw who it was, he collapsed to the floor in shock. It was his own uncle, first-class passenger Arthur Newell of Boston. Vincent Astor claimed his father's body, number 124, and it was carried from the curling rink to Snow's funeral home along the Grand Parade in downtown Halifax, where many of Titanic's bodies were being worked on. That building still stands today and is a seafood restaurant called the Five Fishermen. One of the employees was kind enough to give us a quick tour, showing us that much of the history is still preserved within these walls.
So this is our wine cellar right here. It was like an elevator for bodies. So they actually used to haul bodies up and down between the floors with ropes and pulleys here. And the ropes up on the ceiling, those were to symbolize like the ropes and pulleys that they would use to haul bodies up and down between floors.
The original timbers up there, that's cool. I like how rustic that looks.
Inside the Snow funeral home, the body of John Jacob Astor, one of the richest men, was assigned to an undertaker from Shubenacadie, Nova Scotia, a man named John Logan. His embalming table is in the Lower Selma Museum of the East Hants Historical Society.
It was the embalming table that the very wealthy American John Jacob Astor was laid out on in the preparation of his body for return to the United States. Who owned it was the Logan Carriage Makers and Funeral Home in Shubenacadie. They owned it. Well, it's made of pretty good solid wood. I'm not sure exactly what. It's heavy enough that it could be elm or oak. I think it's amazing that the cane has lasted all these many decades, quite frankly, given what it was used for, because deceased bodies would be laid out on it for the embalming process, and the holes in the caning, of course, enable drainage to happen.
Astor's body was then loaded onto his family's private rail car, his son Vincent escorting it to New York. Body number 1, 9-year-old Walter Van Billiard, the first to be pulled out of the ocean, had been traveling aboard Titanic with his father and older brother, all of whom were lost. His father was found a day after him, and the two of them were shipped to North Wales, Pennsylvania for burial. The bodies of 59 people were claimed and then sent from Halifax for burial elsewhere. Some were destined for Europe, first being sent to New York by rail and then loaded onto steamers. Stephen Campbell and Clifford Crease, along with several other men from the Mackay-Bennett's crew idling in Halifax, checked in frequently with the morticians to see if the body of the 2-year-old that they had found had been claimed yet. So far, he hadn't. His body still lay out on the ice, waiting for family to claim him. Progress aboard the Minia had been slow, and telegraphist Francis Dyke was writing a letter home about how difficult the job was.
Just a few lines to let you know how things are going. I honestly hope I shall never have to come on another expedition like this, as it is far from pleasant. The doctor and I are sleeping in the middle of 14 coffins for the time being. They are all stacked around our quarters aft.
The weather continued to deteriorate for the Minia, and after the first dozen or so bodies had been retrieved, it was becoming harder to find more adrift. Now, Mackay-Bennett's crew was met with some criticism when they returned to Halifax over the number of bodies which were buried at sea. Relatives were waiting to claim these bodies, and some of them felt that that opportunity had been denied. Even with the White Star Line's insistence that all bodies be brought back to Halifax, the Minia ended up burying 2 bodies at sea. They were both firemen, or the men who would shovel coal into the boilers, and neither of them were in good enough condition to be preserved. In Halifax, even with the ice rink to slow the deterioration of the bodies, they couldn't be held much longer. On May 1st, the day after the Mackay-Bennett arrived in port, the first batch of bodies were prepared for local burial. These were mostly unidentified victims, ones that Snow was certain would not be claimed. The city's coroner, John Barnstead, selected a large section of Halifax's secular cemetery in the North End, Fairview Lawn Cemetery. The section was surveyed by E.W. Christie and laid out in 3 large rows of graves with a shorter 4th row in the center. It was a good plot of land, laid on the western face of a gentle slope, where the stones catch the sunset before it disappears behind the trees. It's been said that the curvature of the rows resemble the curvature of a ship's bow. The first body buried was number 110, first-class passenger William Henry Harrison. He was the personal secretary of the White Star Line's director, J. Bruce Ismay. While his wife had requested that his body be returned to England, it was decided that the burial of a White Star Line official would be a good precedent to establish. With so many of Fairview Lawn's Titanic plots being reserved for the unidentified crew and lower class, White Star did not want to give the impression that these were paupers' graves, but instead were indeed dignified enough for one of their own officials. Still, his position came with some privilege, and J. Bruce Ismay paid for a large stone to be placed on his grave. Unlike many of the ones that would follow, Harrison was given his own individual funeral. It took place here. This is the Cathedral Church of All Saints, and at the time of the Titanic, this church was brand new, having been built just 2 years prior. Canon Kenneth Hind, who served as Reverend over Mackay-Bennett's recovery voyage, came from here, where he served as one of the vicars. The service was a simple one. No announcement, no musicians, but the press still described it as a remarkable occasion. The ornate carvings on the wood of the chancel are reminiscent of the craftsmanship of the Harland and Wolff shipbuilders, who carved out Titanic's lavish first-class accommodations. Each of the markers in Fairview would list the body number, even if unidentified, in case they were claimed in the future and needed to be exhumed. Fairview was not the only cemetery that was ready to accept Titanic victims. The nearby Catholic cemetery, Mount Olivet, was seeking bodies confirmed to be of Catholics, and Baron de Hirsch Cemetery, immediately adjacent to Fairview Lawn, was looking for the Jewish victims. There was a bit of controversy surrounding the burial of the Jewish victims. Now, for this part of the story, there are very few sources and it's rarely talked about. So this part's a bit muddy, but this is what seems to have happened. Now, many of the Jewish bodies that had been identified were shipped elsewhere, including Isidor Strauss, body number 96, which had been sent to New York for burial. So the ones left behind in Halifax were unidentified, and in most cases couldn't be verified with certainty that they were actually Jewish. In 1912, there was only one synagogue in Halifax, located around what is today Brunswick Place, and Baron de Hirsch Cemetery belonged to it. However, the congregation was in the middle of a bitter split. Undertaker John Snow worked with the Baron de Hirsch rabbi, Rabbi Jacob Feingold, and identified 9 bodies that he set aside for burial by the rabbi in Baron de Hirsch Cemetery. Snow then continued to prepare the non-Jewish bodies for burial in Fairview Lawn. However, the new Jewish congregation that was breaking off from Baron de Hirsch was not happy that they were not included in the identification process, so they had their own rabbi, Rabbi M. Walter, make his own inspection. He claimed that Rabbi Feingold was wrong and there were actually 44 bodies, which is not likely, and requested to claim all of them for burial in Baron de Hirsch Cemetery, and this request was denied. The night before the first batch of bodies were to be buried in Fairview Lawn, Rabbi Walter entered the Mayflower curling rink and had 10 of those bodies that he had been denied removed for burial in Baron de Hirsch anyway. The problem was, he didn't tell anybody. So when Snow came in the next morning to conduct the burials, he thought they had been stolen. Now, they were stolen, but he thought they were actually body snatched. The police were called. They found the bodies and also discovered that many of the coffins had been damaged in the removal, and upon further inspection, it was confirmed that none of the 10 bodies that were taken were Jewish. The White Star Line had documentation to back that up. Those bodies were returned to Snow, and the rabbis buried the 9 bodies originally assigned to them in Baron de Hirsch Cemetery. A 10th was also given to them. This cemetery is not usually open to the public, so being given access to film these graves is a rare privilege.
We're in Baron de Hirsch Cemetery in Halifax, Nova Scotia. It is the smallest of 3 Titanic cemeteries, and it contains just 10 graves. Just 2 of the people in the cemetery are identified.
The first is Michel Navratil. Michel was from France, and his marriage was crumbling. He knew his wife was going to leave with the children, and so he chose to leave first, taking his 2 kids aboard the Titanic and traveling under a false name, Louis Hoffman.
Michel's mother-in-law had basically poisoned the marriage by telling her daughter, this guy is a loser. The plan apparently was that Michel Sr. would drain the family bank account of all its money except for just enough for Marcel to come to America, where they would be reunited and live happily ever after out of the mother-in-law's clutches.
When Titanic sank, Michel got his 2 children into the lifeboat and stayed behind. His body number 15, was brought back and identified under his false name. Hoffman, being a traditionally Jewish name, landed Michel, a Catholic, in the Jewish cemetery. After his true identity was discovered, the headstone was relabeled to reflect the right name. A Catholic priest was permitted to bless the grave, and the Jewish community of Halifax has continued to maintain the grave as one of their own. Titanic historian Charles Haas shares a touching story of when he visited this cemetery in 1996.
We had with us Michel Navratil Jr., who at that point was in his 80s. And he wanted very much to visit his father's grave. I could see on his face that he was already overcome with emotion, because when he last saw his father, he was only 4 years old, and for many years he had no idea what had become of his father. So when he was given the opportunity to come, he wanted very much to do so. We allowed him to stay at his father's grave as long as he wanted to, and he knelt at the grave. I could hear him, in essence, speaking to his father. At the end of the blessing, we were helping Michel up the hill towards the car that had brought him here. There were tears coursing down his cheeks, and he said, "My father deeply loved music," and while I was with my dad at his grave, I was hearing an etude by Chopin, and I thought that was really amazing to think that his father had chosen to send music into his thinking at that moment. Easily one of the most powerful moments I've had in all my researching of Titanic.
This is a stone from Ellis Island that we brought up. But we didn't bring it up, someone brought it up and let us place it here on Michel Navratil's grave. The other identified grave is that of first-class saloon steward Frederick Wormold. Another case of false identification placed this man, an Anglican, in the Jewish cemetery, but he is cared for nonetheless. May 2nd, 1912, 700 nautical miles out to sea. The wind was icy, the seas were choppy, and the visibility was minimal. The Minia had been out at the wreckage of the Titanic for almost a week now. Francis Dyke had telegraphed the White Star Line the previous day that bodies were spread out too far, and working conditions were rough. They now had 15 bodies on board. most of which were found early in the expedition, and of course not counting the 2 that had been buried at sea. It was determined that the Minia would depart the wreck site the following day, Friday the 3rd, and make its way back to Halifax. The burials in Fairview lawn continued for the following days, starting with the bodies least likely to be claimed, the unidentified. Long trenches were dug for each row, rather than digging out the individual graves. The weekend of May 3rd, 4th, and 5th saw many funerals and memorial services across the city as they continued to mourn the disaster. Most of these funerals were not for individual victims, but rather were for larger groups of bodies or a symbolic gesture for all of Titanic's dead. It's said that most of Halifax's citizens were in attendance to at least one of these services. The Cathedral of All Saints, which held a funeral a few days prior for Ismay's secretary William Harrison, held another funeral for the Anglicans lost in the disaster. While it no longer stands, a large Protestant service was held at the Brunswick Street Methodist Church. An American woman named Lena Rood, now a widow, traveled to Halifax with the hopes of claiming her husband's body. It wasn't found, but she donated the flowers to this service in his memory. As the bodies of the victims were being processed, it was discovered that many of them, especially in 3rd class, were Roman Catholic, and so the Archdiocese of Halifax wanted to give them a proper Catholic burial in their own cemetery, Mount Olivet. 19 bodies of Catholics were prepared for burial. Today, 14 have names, and 5 remain unidentified. However, one has since been named, but the stone has not yet been updated to reflect that. Like most of the stones at Fairview Lawn and all of the stones in Baron de Hirsch, the stones in Mount Olivet followed the same pattern, a rectangular shape with a slightly angled top, carved in with names, if known, the body number, and the tragic date of April the 15th, 1912. There were other Catholics buried in Halifax, several in Fairview Lawn, and at least one in Baron de Hirsch, as I mentioned, but there was no demand for the bodies to be exhumed and brought to Mount Olivet. They were simply left in peace. The bodies of 4 women, who were initially unidentified but known to be Catholics, were brought to St. Mary's Cathedral on Spring Garden Road. A requiem mass was held for their souls and all of the souls of the faithful departed. The church, like at many of the services in Halifax, was overcrowded, with those wishing to pay their respects and pray for the dead. The church at the time was beautifully decorated, but after the Second World War, many of the murals were painted over white. Today, the church, still impressive and beautiful, is working hard to restore its exquisite original artwork that decorated the Titanic funerals. Margaret Rice, body number 12, and found on the first day of Mackay-Bennett's search, was from Ireland, having boarded in Queenstown. She was a widow and traveled with her 5 sons, all 10 or younger, and all lost in the sinking. She was one of 4 unidentified bodies present for the Catholic funeral mass. In her purse, she had a medicine box from Ireland, which had the name of the pharmacist in Ireland printed on it. Those working to identify the bodies sent a telegram to the pharmacist, who in turn supplied them with the name of the woman who placed that order, and sure enough, she was on the passenger list. That is the extent to which these authorities went to give these bodies their names. It was around the time of these funerals that the White Star Line was discussing with A.G. Jones if it was worth chartering another body recovery expedition to the wreck. Would they find anything? Now, they strongly felt that even if they found one body, it would be worth it. But was finding one body a realistic expectation at this point? Captain Lardner of the Mackay-Bennett was asked his opinion, and he was doubtful, but he informed them that the Mackay-Bennett was at their service if needed. He was ready to take the Bennett out for a second journey, but the White Star Line told him to hold off for now. At this point, if a body was going to be claimed, it would have been already. And so the crew of the Mackay-Bennett went back to the Mayflower curling rink to see if their boy had been claimed yet. He hadn't. He still lay in his box out on the ice. He had no family who would claim him. He had no one who would take him home. And so the crew of the Mackay-Bennett and the morticians led by Snow felt it was time to give this boy a proper burial. Now the White Star Line was paying for all of the burials, but Mary Walsh, the female undertaker responsible for the children as well, took care of this one free of charge. The crew of the Bennett, especially Mr. Campbell and Mr. Crease, felt that this deserved something special. The Astor family had been good on their word, and the $100,000 prize money had been paid out to the crew of the Mackay-Bennett, split into roughly $2,500 shares for each man, or about $82,000 in today's money. Each man took a portion of that money and chipped in to pay for the funeral, the flowers, and a larger headstone. A metal breastplate that simply said "Our Babe" was bought for this unknown child and placed in the coffin with him on his chest, along with a red note that said "God bless our son." Halifax was known in the press now as the City of the Dead, but the series of funerals stopped for that day, Saturday, May 4th. There was only one funeral that day, and the whole city was said to be in attendance at St. George's Anglican Church, a uniquely round wooden building on Brunswick Street. Canon Kenneth Hind came to the church to preside over the service. He had been the reverend aboard the Mackay-Bennett when the young boy was found, and this was as important to him as it was to the Bennett's crew. The crowd of thousands of mourners outside the church parted ways as 6 of the Mackay-Bennett's crew carried the small white coffin into the church, led by Campbell and Crease, who first found him. The entire city was silent as the coffin was placed in the center of the church and the service began. Every single one of Mackay-Bennett's 75 crewmen were in attendance. There were so many flowers, more than could fit on the coffin or around the church, but that's what the crew of the Mackay-Bennett bought. These were some of the roughest sailors of the seas. They worked on cable ships in the cold North Atlantic for weeks on end. And yet, they so deeply loved this child. And they purchased all of these flowers excessively. Nothing that was within their means was too much to buy him. When the service was over, the coffin was carried back out, loaded into Snow's hearse, and brought to Fairview Lawn Cemetery, where a special plot near the top of the hill was ready for him. The stone that the crew bought for him was one of the largest of all of the Titanic graves in Halifax. The inscription reads, "Erected in the memory of an unknown child whose remains were recovered after the disaster to the Titanic, April 15th, 1912. The placement of his grave was intentional. He's at the foot of another grave, body number 206, Mrs. Alma Paulson. Alma was from Sweden, traveling with her 4 young children to the United States, where her husband was waiting for them. She and the children were lost in the sinking. Her body was found, but none of her children were, even though they are all memorialized on her headstone. Her youngest was around the age of the unknown child, and there was a possibility that this baby was hers. On that chance, they wanted them close to each other. In any case, Alma was a mother who had lost her children, and this unknown child now had no family. The idea was that it was fitting to rest them with each other, even if there turned out to be no connection. Today, she is not the child's only guardian.
Clifford Crease, who was one of the recovery crew on the Mackay-Bennett, he and Stephen Campbell recovered the body. Clifford was very taken by the loss of the baby, as was the crew. He didn't speak about it at all to his family, but every year a bouquet of yellow roses would be left at the grave of the unknown child, and after Clifford passed away, it ceased happening.
Clifford passed away in 1961 and is buried with his wife, but even in death, he is looking out for the child. His stone, located about 250 feet away, faces the boy with a clear line of sight. Stephen Campbell, the other man who recovered the boy, passed away in 1916, and his grave, significantly closer to the unknown child, also faces him, both watching out for him. I have no doubt that these two men thought of that child every day. Today, visitors still leave gifts on the stone of the Titanic's unknown child: toy cars, candy, pocket change. Periodically, these items are all collected and stored by the Titanic Society of Atlantic Canada in the child's toy chest, if you will. When the bodies were prepared for burial, they were redressed, given fresh, clean clothes untarnished by the sea. Their old clothing needed to be disposed of. Out of respect, it was ceremonially burned by the Halifax Police Department. All but the small brown pair of leather shoes that the unknown child wore when he was found. Before they were thrown into the incinerator, an officer saved them, not wishing to see them burned. He kept them in his desk for years, not knowing what to do with them. After he passed, his family donated them, and they are now on display in the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. The Minia returned to Halifax on Monday, May 6th, traveling to the same coal wharf that Mackay-Bennett offloaded at. The 15 bodies were brought up to the curling rink and joined the bodies from the Mackay-Bennett to await burial, except for the body of Charles Hayes, loaded onto his rail car and shipped away. This is a set of 6 White Star Line uniform buttons, said to have been removed from a body retrieved by the Minia. The manufacturer's stamps on the back date to 1911 and likely came off of a steward whose uniform jackets had 6 buttons. The discussion of a third recovery mission was brought up again by the White Star Line, and on the same day that the Minia returned, the next body ship was sent out. This was the Montmagny, a lighthouse supply ship that White Star Line had chartered from Canada's Department of Fisheries. Undertaker John Snow, previously of the Mackay-Bennett, joined the ship for this voyage, with 2 ministers this time, Reverend Prince of St. Paul's Anglican and Father McQuillan of St. Mary's Catholic. They found 4 bodies, one of which was buried at sea. A 4th ship was chartered, the Algerine, a cargo ship that set out on May 16th, this time setting out from St. John's, Newfoundland. It found just one final body, the body of saloon steward James McGrady. The Algerine didn't come to Halifax and instead transferred the body to a ship that was going there, the Florizel, also out of Newfoundland, which brought McGrady to Nova Scotia on June 11th. With that, the White Star Line called off the recovery efforts, and Mr. James McGrady, body number 330, was the last body recovered from the disaster. He was taken to Halifax, a city that had now moved on and was readied for burial. By now, every unclaimed body had been buried in one of the 3 cemeteries, and James McGrady joined the other 120 victims in Fairview Lawn Cemetery, bringing the total number in that cemetery to 121. Of course, when the bodies were initially buried, they didn't have these stone markers. They had temporary grave markers made of wood. The stone ones wouldn't be placed until a year later. The stones that we see today are made of black gabbro rock, mined from a quarry in New Brunswick. As the decades passed, routine maintenance was carried out, paid for by a trust fund set up by the White Star Line to ensure perpetual care for the victims. Visitors came from around the world to see the infamous Titanic Cemetery, with the number of sightseers that Fairview Lawn receives far eclipsing that which Mount Olivet and Baron de Hirsch receive combined.
We know people come here even in the snow. It's become a year-round pilgrimage for anyone coming to Halifax who has any knowledge of the story. And in any language, you could say Titanic and you can see people in their eyes right away. They know the story, but they come here year-round, which is a wonderful tribute to this gravesite.
Some people come for the importance of the site. Some to visit specific individuals. John Hume, better known as Jacques, was body number 193 and was a violinist in Titanic's orchestra. Luigi Gatti, born in Italy, was manager of Titanic's first-class a la carte restaurant on B deck, whose grave has come to represent the entire restaurant staff. Out of 69 of them, only 2 survived the sinking. J. Dawson, a grave popularized by the 1997 film Titanic, is often willingly misrepresented as the grave of the fictional Jack Dawson, played by Leonardo DiCaprio. J. Dawson, in reality, was Joseph Dawson, a 23-year-old Irishman who served in Titanic's crew as a coal trimmer. It's been said that James Cameron got the idea for Jack Dawson's name from this stone. Well, that's not true, it was simply a coincidence. I wish there was time to tell you about each and every one of these graves individually, but there are too many. The sheer number of unmarked graves is haunting, a silent testament to the lives abruptly ended. Each weathered stone stands in quiet remembrance of someone who once had a destination, a purpose, and perhaps a family awaiting their arrival. These souls embarked on a journey that they believed would lead them safely to a new world, never imagining that their voyage would end in such tragedy. Although notes were carefully recorded for each one, such as descriptions of bodies, clothing, and inventories of personal effects, no name could be attached to their memories. Their identities, like their lives, were lost to the depths. Nobody would come to claim them.
I think more than anything else, the sight of those stones brings home the real human cost of that night. It's so easy to look at a list of names in a book. It doesn't touch you. It's cold. And when you see that there are human remains underneath these stones, the two of us stood there crying, because this is where their journey ended, and it wasn't supposed to be that way.
Charles Haas, author, historian, and president of the Titanic International Society, has visited Halifax numerous times to pay his respects at the graves. To him, though, the vast number of unidentified victims deserves a second look. It was in the 1990s when this re-examination took place, and with 80 years of Titanic research having occurred since the sinking, the Titanic International Society's members and researchers were able to re-examine the clues that the original investigators had on hand in 1912 that they thoroughly preserved for future generations, and they were able to identify nearly 24 of them with varying degrees of certainty. After verifying the research, 6 of these newly discovered names were inscribed on the front face of their stones, giving some of their names back after all these years. But what of Titanic's foremost unknown grave, that of the unknown child? Researchers had been desperate to someday identify him. In an effort led by Dr. Ryan Parr and Alan Ruffman, his grave and 2 others were exhumed in 2001 for possible DNA sampling. Nothing remained of the other 2 bodies, although there were fragments of coffin and even the stems of the flowers that they had been buried with. But in the unknown child's grave, a small sample of bone and a few teeth were found. They were preserved beneath the metal breastplate that the Mackay-Bennett's crew had placed on him. 6 children were lost on the Titanic who matched the unknown child's age range, and with DNA sampling, a few were ruled out immediately. He wasn't related to Alma Paulson, so he wasn't one of her 4 children as was initially suggested. A vague DNA match was found in 2002 to the living relatives of 13-month-old Aino Panula, with about 50% certainty. 2 of the other children couldn't be ruled out, but they were hitting dead ends with them, and a 50% match is a pretty good one. Still, prematurely, Aino Panula was announced as the likely candidate for the unknown child's identity. But the research was ongoing, and other investigators pointed to the pair of shoes that belonged to the child. They were too big for a baby of 13 months. They called on the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory in Rockville, Maryland, and with newly discovered DNA samples of the living relatives of the other two candidates, they were able to identify with certainty that the unknown child's grave belonged to that of 18-month-old Sidney Leslie Goodwin of England. The unknown child had come to represent all of the children lost in the disaster, similar to the tombs of unknown soldiers. So it was decided that the original monument sponsored by Mackay-Bennett's crew would not be inscribed with the new name. Instead, a small footstone separate from the large monument would be placed with the child's real name. He is not forgotten. George Wright's body was never found by any of the recovery ships, but his brother insisted on having a headstone placed in his honor in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. It was erected in Christ Church Cemetery. George Wright's house still stands today on Yonge Avenue in Halifax. His beautiful home was built in 1902 in the Queen Anne style. Today, it is a listed historical home and belongs to the local Council of Women. Hilda Slayter married just 2 months after the disaster and became Hilda Luján. She eventually moved to the Isle of Wight in England, where she died in 1965. Her body was brought back to her native Halifax and buried in Camp Hill Cemetery. In that same cemetery is another grave with a Titanic connection. Frank McGee was the ship's surgeon aboard the RMS Carpathia when it picked up Titanic's survivors, including Hilda. He and his assistants attended to every one of Titanic's survivors, treating injuries, hypothermia, and shock. Frank died in 1933. J.A. Snow's funeral home, which led the mortician services for Titanic's victims, is still around today and is the oldest funeral home in the area and continues to provide its services to the community. Halifax was once called the City of the Dead, and its role in the Titanic disaster draws in thousands of tourists a year. The Titanic Society of Atlantic Canada works hard to help these visitors, to maintain Titanic sites across the maritime provinces, and to protect the undying legacy of the Titanic disaster in Nova Scotia. The Society hosts meetings and commemorative events in both the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic and at the local Council of Women in the George Wright House. They also have a focus on both George Wright and Hilda Slayter, the only two known native Atlantic Canadians who were aboard the Titanic. To support them, the Titanic Society of Atlantic Canada accepts donations at the address in the link in the description below. Every anniversary of the sinking, the Society sponsors a wreath to be brought to the wreck site by the International Ice Patrol. Our team here at HFX Studios has been doing the same each year. The Maritime Museum of the Atlantic has a fantastic display on the Titanic disaster, featuring many artifacts shown in this video, and is a great place to visit for people of all ages. A special thank you to Blair Bede, whose excellent book, Titanic Victims in Halifax Graveyards, is a wonderful companion for anyone looking to learn about the Titanic graves in Halifax. Thank you as well to our sponsor, the Stevens Group, for making this video possible, and for all that they do to support the communities of Nova Scotia. The story of the Titanic has taken such a prominent place in Western culture, and so it's important that the graves, both identified and unknown, on land and at sea, are not forgotten. There's been a lot of misinformation about ocean liners, especially here on YouTube, and so a bunch of historians and I have put together the Steam and Splendor Network, where you can learn more about Titanic's incredible story or the story of similar vessels from the perspective of accredited historians. I've also put together a full video about telegraph operator Francis Dyke's letter written aboard the Minia, which was featured in this documentary, and that video will be published on the Steam and Splendor Network as well. Check out the description for a link. A special thank you to my supporters on Patreon, especially Marlo Perez, Kelly Black, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Kaiser Friedrich III, Zach Richards, Donald Anderson, Cody Henricks, Joan Haynes, Sean Kimball, Glenn Biddiscombe, Stephen Schwankers, Gabriel Colomb, RGB, Tara Mollikar, Keith Holland, Rob M., Amos Mayhew, Corey Andrews, Nicholas Masella, Cole Tannick, Sophie Baber, Rob, Oliver Chin-Chen, John Maluski, David Watipka, Tiffany Raridan, Mad Time Media, Nathan Gutierrez, Max Metcalf, David Littlejohn, Sean Sahi Frazier, Nikki Chan 92, Corbin McDonald, Matthew Burns, Goblin of the Salt Plains, Luke Stevens, Gordon Robbins, Aaron Stark, Troy Wentworth, Clarkey, Sam Forker, Busy B, Christopher Rosendale, Road Weary, Kitty Bits, Taniel 38, Kenzo Buick, Brian Reedy, Eden Cleefish, Bless Moles, Coda Yoda 16, Carol Adams, Clay Hobbs, Steve Valley, Gojira's Trains, J.C. Hobbs, High Treason, The Peppermilk, Tristan White, Jason Stray, Chance Hudson, Robert Mayer III, Jordan Page, The Handler, Georgia Tsifa, Drew Shelton, Craven Moorhead, Jennifer and Sarah Vaughn, Ben Reese, Kenneth Hendricks, Aaron Prochaska, David Douglas, Alan and Modesta Charlone, Eric Castle, and Lottie Cat.